The letter attributed to Pilate, in which he supposedly informs the Roman Emperor Tiberius about Jesus, offers a fascinating account that transcends what is found in the Gospels. In this document, Pilate not only describes the physical appearance of Jesus in a captivating way, but he also mentions his miracles, the trial, the crucifixion, and even the resurrection, highlighting the significance of this figure in the history of Judea and beyond. But what does this letter truly reveal? Pilate begins his writing addressed to Tiberius with a respectful greeting, expressing the urgency of relaying the extraordinary events that have taken place in his province. In his opening lines, the governor recounts his unease at observing that all the deities seem to have abandoned him, which leads him to question his own fate in coming to Judea. Since his arrival, his experience has been marked by distress and constant concern. He narrates a significant episode in which he organized a grand banquet and extended invitations to notable figures, such as a tetrarch of Galilee and the high priest. However, the fact that no one showed up for the dinner, he took as an affront to his authority and the Roman government. Following this incident, the high priest visited him with a serious and disdainful demeanor, claiming that his religion did not permit him to eat with Romans. However, Pilate's eyes could see beyond the words, and he noted that this attitude revealed a deep opposition to Roman rule. From his perspective, the high priests were dangerous characters who would not hesitate to betray the government for personal ambition. Pilate continues to describe his experience governing Jerusalem, a city he considers particularly problematic due to its rebellious population. The constant pressure of a possible revolt keeps him on edge, especially given that his military resources are limited. He only has 1 centurion and 100 soldiers at his command. When seeking assistance from the governor of Syria, he learns that they cannot provide reinforcements either, which further exacerbates his concerns for the stability of his governance. In his attempt to understand the local population, Pilate immerses himself in the rumors circulating about a young preacher from Galilee who speaks of a new message in the name of a God who has sent him. Initially, he fears that this individual might incite the people to revolution. However, at the same time, he realizes that Jesus of Nazareth appears to be a friend of Rome rather than an enemy, given his discourse and the way he interacts with the people. One day, while walking, he sees Jesus surrounded by a captivated crowd, which compels him to listen more attentively to what the young man has to say. Pilate refrains from interrupting his speech and instead decides to send his secretary, Manios, to mingle with the crowd and report back on Jesus' teachings. Manios, who has a background in conspiracy and is familiar with Hebrew, returns to the praetorium with a story that instills Pilate with a new respect for the young prophet. What impressed Pilate the most were the words of Jesus, which contrasted sharply with the wisdom of philosophers. For example, when a Jewish rebel asked him about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus responded with a clarity and depth that resonated beyond the immediate context. His words, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's," not only demonstrated his mastery but also led Pilate to consider the possibility of releasing Jesus, even though he had the power to imprison or exile him, as was customary in Roman governance. Jesus did not behave like an instigator or a rebel. In fact, he was offering me a form of protection, even if he perhaps did not recognize it himself. He had the freedom to act, to speak, to gather with the people, to choose his disciples, and to teach without any interference from my side. However, if one day, God's forbid, the religion of our ancestors were to be replaced by that of Jesus, such tolerance could lead to the downfall of Rome. In that case, I would see myself as a fortunate instrument in what the Jews call providence and what we refer to as destiny. The freedom I granted to Jesus made the more powerful and wealthy Jews uncomfortable. Their criticisms were sharp, leading me to let him go free. He often addressed the scribes and Pharisees, comparing them to snakes. He claimed they were like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but full of death on the inside. On numerous occasions, he questioned local traditions, asserting that humility was more valuable in the eyes of God than any social status. Almost daily, I received complaints in the praetorium about his boldness, and I was warned that something terrible might happen to him, reminding me that Jerusalem had a history of stoning those who proclaimed themselves prophets. An appeal was being prepared to take the matter to Caesar, but the Senate supported my decisions and promised to send reinforcements after the Persian War. Since I did not have enough troops to suppress a potential revolt, I decided to take measures to restore peace in the city without diminishing my own authority. Thus, I wrote to Jesus, inviting him to converse in the praetorium, and he accepted. Being of Spanish and Roman blood, I was usually not easily intimidated or excited. However, when Jesus arrived, I found myself on my balcony and felt as if my feet were glued to the marble floor, trembling uncontrollably, like someone overwhelmed by guilt. In contrast, the Nazarene was serene, exuding a calm that seemed to evoke innocence. He approached and paused, with a gesture that anticipated his presence without the need for words. For a moment, I felt captivated and in awe of this man, who surpassed the image of the gods and heroes that our artists had modeled. There was nothing repulsive about him, but I felt fragile and old when compared to his youthful figure. Finally, with a trembling voice, I said to him, "Jesus of Nazareth, in recent years, I have granted you total freedom of expression and I do not regret it. Your words are practical and full of wisdom. I do not know if you have read Socrates or Plato, but your simplicity and majesty elevate you above them." I mentioned that the emperor was aware of his message and, as a representative of Rome, I felt satisfied to have granted him that freedom. However, I warned him that this freedom had attracted powerful enemies. I told him that, like Socrates, his critics had multiplied because of the harshness of his words and because I had allowed him to speak without restrictions. Some even accused me of conspiring with him to undermine the scarce civil power that Rome allowed the Hebrews. My recommendation, which was not an order, was that he be more prudent and moderate in his pronouncements. I explained to him that his enemies could exploit his pride to incite the ignorant populace against him, forcing me to act against him according to the law. Jesus, maintaining his composure, replied to me, "Ruler of the earth, your words do not reflect true wisdom. Ask the mountain to stop in the valley. It will say it must obey the laws of nature and the Creator God, who alone knows where the waters flow. I assure you, before the rose of Sharon blossoms, the blood of the just will be shed." I felt a mix of emotion and concern as I heard that his blood was more valuable than that of the Pharisees who abused Roman liberty. He accused them of conspiring against Caesar and portraying him as a tyrant. I promised him that I would protect him, assuring him that my praetorium would be a sacred refuge for him, day and night. The great Jewish festival of Passover was approaching, bringing with it the desire to capitalize on the fervor that this time generated in Jerusalem. The city was filled with a noisy clamor. A crowd was shouting for Jesus' death. According to information I received, the temple treasury had been used to bribe the populace. The situation was becoming critical, and in light of the imminent danger, a Roman centurion was designated to lead 100 infantry soldiers and 100 cavalry, although he was hesitant to accept the mission. I felt isolated, surrounded only by a small group of veterans in a hostile environment. The shortage of soldiers made containing a possible revolt an almost impossible task. The only option left was to endure the relentless clamor of the crowd, which did not cease in its fervor of "Crucify him." In this context, three factions united in their opposition to Jesus: the Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. The ambivalent stance of the Herodians and Sadducees was driven by two motivations: their hatred for Jesus and their weariness of Roman domination. They never forgave him for entering the holy city with standards displaying the image of the emperor, which they considered an unforgivable sacrilege. Furthermore, he had proposed using part of the temple treasury to finance public works, which the Pharisees deemed unacceptable. They were enemies of Jesus and were resentful of the harsh criticisms he directed at them throughout his journeys. This scenario was further complicated by a chaotic populace prone to riots, always ready to seize any opportunity that arose. Jesus was brought before the high priest and condemned to death. It was at that moment that Caiaphas, the high priest, seemed to signal to me that I should confirm the sentence to ensure its execution. I responded that since Jesus was from Galilee, the case should be transferred to Herod, and I ordered his dispatch. However, Herod, showing apparent humility and deference to the representative of Caesar, sent Jesus back to me, passing the responsibility. My palace soon became inundated with discontent, with the number of opponents growing by the moment. Jerusalem was taken over by crowds descending from the hills of Nazareth. All of Judea seemed to converge on the city. A seer named Gausa threw herself at my feet in tears, warning me not to touch that man because he was holy. She claimed to have seen him walking on water, speaking to the storm and the fish of the lake, and everyone obeyed him. Her visions were chilling. She spoke of rivers running with blood, statues of Caesar crying, and the sun appearing as a mourning virgin. She warned me that if I did not heed my wife's pleas, a great evil awaited me. Amid all this turmoil, the marble steps vibrated under the weight of the crowd as Jesus was brought back to me. I went to the courts of justice, surrounded by my guard, and asked firmly what they wanted. The response was unanimous. They wanted Jesus' death. When I inquired about his crime, they replied that he had blasphemed, that he had prophesied the destruction of the temple and proclaimed himself the Son of God, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. I insisted that Roman justice does not condemn someone to death for such accusations, but the cries of "Crucify him!" echoed with fury, shaking the walls of my palace. Amid all that chaotic situation, Jesus was the only one who remained serene. After several frustrated attempts to protect Jesus from the fury of his enemies, I decided to propose a measure that could save him: the release of a prisoner, as was customary during the festivities. However, the people insisted on crucifying Jesus. I tried to argue, pointing out that their actions were inconsistent with their own laws, that according to Jewish law, no judge could condemn an accused without having first subjected him to fasting for a full day, and that the sentence required the consent of the Sanhedrin. Moreover, according to the law, no one could be executed on the same day that the sentence was pronounced. Every trial had to be reviewed the next day by the Sanhedrin. My insistence, however, did not diminish the clamor of the crowd, which only grew more hateful. In a moment of desperation, I took a basin and washed my hands before them, declaring that, in my judgment, Jesus of Nazareth had committed nothing deserving of death. But my words were in vain. Jesus' fate was already decided. I had never seen such fury in the crowds. Nothing could compare to what was unfolding that day. It seemed that all the dark forces had gathered. In the midst of that situation, the atmosphere became grim. Thus, I observed, from a corner of my basilica, the tragic moment when the innocent Nazarene was led to his execution while an air of sadness and desolation hovered over Jerusalem. My heart, heavy with sorrow, foretold that this was something more than just a conflict among men. It was a drama resonating with divine echoes. Close to the first hour of the night, I wrapped myself in my cloak and descended toward the city, heading for the gates of Golgotha. The sacrifice had already been consumed, and the crowd was beginning to disperse, still agitated but enveloped in a somber air of regret for what they had witnessed. As I walked, I noticed my small Roman court passing silently, visibly dejected. The flag-bearer draped his standard, bearing the eagle, in mourning, a gesture that reflected the gravity of the moment. I could hear some Jewish soldiers murmuring words I did not understand, while others commented on the miracles, which the Romans always associated with their gods. As I progressed, certain groups of men and women paused in their path, directing melancholic looks toward Mount Calvary, as if awaiting some unexpected sign. I returned to the praetorium with a heavy heart, climbing the stairs still stained with the blood of the Nazarene. Once there, I noticed an elderly man on his knees, in a posture of supplication, surrounded by Roman soldiers who were weeping. He threw himself at my feet and began to sob bitterly. Seeing an old man cry is always painful, and my heart, already burdened with sadness, was touched even more. We cried together, and it seemed that everyone there, both he and many in the crowd, were on the verge of tears. I had never witnessed anything so moving. Those who had betrayed, sold, and shouted for his crucifixion were now disappearing like cowards. I heard that some of them were washing their hands with vinegar, recalling what Jesus had said about the resurrection and the separation of the dead. After regaining my composure, I asked who he was and what he desired. "I am Joseph of Arimathea," he replied. "I come to ask you for permission to bury Jesus of Nazareth." I granted his request and gave my men permission to take some soldiers to accompany the burial, ensuring the body would not be desecrated. A few days later, the tomb was found empty, and the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, as he himself had predicted. This event generated even more commotion than his own death. I cannot assert with certainty what truly occurred, but I thoroughly investigated this matter. You can check it for yourself and decide if I made any mistakes, as Herod claims. Joseph used his own tomb for Jesus' burial, but I cannot say whether he was aware of or planned something related to the resurrection. The day after the burial, a priest arrived at the praetorium, concerned about the possibility that the disciples would steal Jesus' body to make it appear that he had risen, as he had predicted and in which they firmly believed. I sent the captain of the guard, Marcus, ordering him to post as many Jewish soldiers as necessary around the tomb, so that if anything happened, the blame would fall on them and not on the Romans. When the news of the empty tomb spread, my concern grew. I sought out Marcus, who informed me that he had sent his lieutenant Benham with 100 soldiers to guard the site. He mentioned that Isam and his men were terrified by the events of that morning. I called Isam and asked him to recount what had happened with as much precision as possible. He told me that around the beginning of the fourth watch, a soft and radiant light appeared above the tomb. Initially, he thought that some women had come to anoint the body of Jesus, as was customary, but he could not understand how they could have passed by the guards. While he was reflecting on this, the atmosphere lit up, and he saw what appeared to be a multitude of the dead in their shrouds, all looking younger and filled with joy. Suddenly, the earth began to shake with such force that he, weakened, felt he could not stand, as if the ground were moving beneath his feet. Then, he lost consciousness completely, not knowing what happened next. I asked him what state he was in when he regained consciousness, and he said he was lying on the ground, face down. I questioned whether he might have confused the light, thinking it was dawn in the east. He said that while he initially thought so, it was still very dark in the near distance, and he remembered that it was too early for day. I asked if the fainting could have been caused by getting up too quickly, as that can provoke such a sensation. He denied having done so, pointing out that he had not slept all night, as the penalty for sleeping on duty was death. He mentioned that he had allowed some of the soldiers to sleep at that moment, and some were still sleeping. I inquired how long the scene lasted, and he responded that he was not sure, but estimated that the vision lasted nearly an hour until it was covered by daylight. I asked if he had gone to see the tomb after regaining consciousness, but he said no, because he was scared, and when the reinforcements arrived, they all returned to the barracks. I asked if the priests had interrogated him, and he confirmed that they had. The priests wanted him to assert that everything had been caused by an earthquake and that the guards were sleeping. They offered money for him to say that the disciples had come and stolen Jesus' body, but he had not seen any disciples and only knew that the body had disappeared when he was informed. Digging deeper into the opinions of the priests with whom he spoke, he said that some believed Jesus was not an ordinary man, that he was not simply the son of Mary, as was said, but was a figure who had already been on earth before, in the times of Abraham, Lot, and many other moments and places. If this Jewish theory is correct, such conclusions seem to make sense, as they align with what we know of this man's life. It is widely recognized, both by friends and adversaries, that Jesus seemed to have control over the elements. Like a potter shaping clay, he turned water into wine, healed diseases, raised the dead, calmed storms, and even attracted fish with coins in their mouths. If he could perform all these feats, as testified by the Jews, and it was precisely by doing this that he awakened so many hostilities, it is clear that he was not accused of crimes, nor of violating laws or harming anyone. These events are known to thousands, both friends and adversaries. I am inclined to agree with the statement of someone who was on the cross. Truly, this was the Son of God. Pontius Pilate described Jesus as a unique and impressive figure. Jesus was an average-sized man, with a calm demeanor and a serene presence that attracted those around him. His face reflected kindness and peace, radiating tranquility even in moments of tension. He showed compassion toward others, as if he deeply understood each one of them. Accounts indicate that Jesus had long, soft hair that fell gracefully over his shoulders, with slight waves and a color that varied between light brown and blonde, distinguishing him among the inhabitants of the region. His eyes, deep and penetrating, displayed shades ranging from light brown to blue, which conferred wisdom and kindness. Jesus' skin was fair and smooth, similar to that of someone who works outdoors, but it looked healthy and well cared for. His face was handsome and symmetrical, with features that inspired trust and reverence, emanating authority without being threatening. He dressed simply and with dignity, without adornments or jewelry, reflecting his detachment from material things. His appearance communicated humility and simplicity, conveying a message of peace and welcome without the need for words.